Michael Christian, welcome to AFL Nation.
Thanks, Gerard. Yeah, great to be here.
How do you interpret the verdicts of the appeals board last night?
Well, it's certainly been a long week, hasn't it? Look, I think that both Brisbane and GWS have used the system in place and have got an outcome that obviously is beneficial to them. So I say good luck to them. That's the system in place. There's an MRO function which I obviously oversee, a tribunal function, and then if clubs aren't happy with the MRO function grading, they can go to the tribunal. If they're not happy with the tribunal, they can go to an appeals board, and that's what Brisbane and GWS did, and they obviously were successful.
The appeals board in both cases made a point of, they said, looking at the video and concluding that they didn't believe the conduct was likely to cause injury. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I do, because I graded it differently to that at my level. I think it's worth just emphasising that at my function revolves around looking at a video, looking at, we often get as many as 10 different camera angles. So my responsibility is to analyse those camera angles and make a determination, and that's ratified by the AFL, and then that finding and grading is released. So as far as my function goes, the critical element is to look at the conduct of an incident. So there's effectively three outcomes. There's no action to be taken, there's careless conduct, or there's intentional conduct. So in assessing that, particularly in regard to tackles, there's four main factors that the guidelines identify with respect to tackles. The first one is we don't see very often anymore. It's a double action. It's where the tackle's held and then there's a clear double action. We don't see that a lot. And particularly now that the umpire, of recent times at least, have that a little adjustment with the umpires blowing the whistle a little bit earlier when the ball clearly is held in. So that certainly helped that. There's a spear tackle, which we don't see much of anymore. And then the two critical elements, the other factors, are vulnerability and force. So the determination is to assess whether the person being tackled is in a vulnerable position. And I considered in both these cases that the player was, Liam Duggan and Tim Taranto were highly vulnerable. Both arms pinned all the way to the ground. And probably you could argue in Charlie Cameron's case, if not pinned, trapped. So highly vulnerable. And then it's a question of force, and the guidelines talk around whether a player is slung, driven, or rotated with excessive force. So they're not exclusive. So when a player is highly vulnerable, obviously force is a factor, but I considered that both players were highly vulnerable and that they were driven in this case, not rotated or slung, but driven to the ground with excessive force. So once that conduct assessment is made, I determined based on those factors that it was careless. Now, obviously, we can talk, if you like, about the way the system was. Back in 2014, we had three factors. There was negligent, reckless, and intentional. Now, for reasons that I can go into if you like, certainly my understanding at least, it was changed at the end of 2014, before my time, to careless. So obviously within that careless bracket, we have incidents that are at the lower end of careless and at the higher end of careless. And that's reflected, I suppose, in the penalties that are handed down. So, for example, I sought and I graded both Charlie Cameron and Toby Bedford as low-end careless because that was the 3 weeks. And we can talk about impact if you like. But whereas Jimmy Webster, for example, his incident earlier this year was graded a lot higher and was regarded as high-end careless. But nonetheless, they are careless.
If the same incidents happened this weekend, would you grade them exactly the same in light of the appeals board outcomes?
Well, can I first say that the same incident won't happen again? But to answer the question, the answer is yes.
Are front-on tackles reportable, like what we saw with Charlie Cameron, if they're delivered with too much force, Chrisso?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that absolutely. I mean,
Yep.
I'm not sure of the question, Tom. Like, yeah,
So front-on tackles, it was a unique incident. Like, we haven't seen many incidents like this where a player tackles another player and they land on the back of their head. So if it is delivered with too much force,
yeah,
do you
well,
think that it comes under the careless banner?
No, the fundamentals are exactly the same. The assessment about vulnerability and the assessment about force. So, yeah, if a player is vulnerable and driven with excessive force, and that was my opinion of that tackle, then it tips into the careless category.
Why doesn't the appeals board verdict flow back to change the way that you would assess the same scenario?
Gerard, I don't want to get into the details of the appeal because that's not my function. But what I will say is that my understanding, and having read what happened last night, is that there was an error of law from the tribunal.
So more legal technicality.
From what I understand, correct.
Yep.
So my role in my little box and my little function, and tucked away watching video, hours after hour, I've been given the guidelines as my reference point to make adjudications on whether a tackle, in this example, was careless or not. And so I use those guidelines, and as I said, around vulnerability and around force, I determined that I certainly concede they were low end careless, and that was reflected in the penalty, but careless nonetheless.
Do you think you will have observed the week?
Yep.
That the football world, so the participants and the observers, separate to the AFL,
Yep.
just simply weren't ready for these instances to be suspensions?
It's a really interesting point. I remember, and Gerard, you will remember this, Tom, I think you were probably a bit young, round 12, 2015, Bryce Gibbs tackled Robbie Gray.
Yep.
Knocked him out. Do you remember it, Tom?
Marvel Stadium.
I reckon it was MCG, but I stand to be
But
corrected.
I remember the incident. Everyone went ballistic.
So this was a dance around rotation with excessive force, both arms pinned. Gray was knocked out cold, and there was a suspension. In those days, it was the match review panel, and I was part of that. And it was that they were the days when you got a week. If you pleaded guilty, you got a week off. So the penalty was 3 weeks down to 2 because he accepted. But there was public outcry about how can the perfect tackle be suspended. And it's almost a little bit deja vu, but we have come so far over the last 10 years. And before I talk more about that, I'd like to reference the evolution of the bump. In my estimation, it's taken probably 15 years for not only, and I'm talking, I think it took a lot quicker for the players, but for the media and the general football public to identify that you cannot have elect a bump and get shoulder to head and not be sanctioned. Because I think anyone that watches football today, if there's a bump tonight that's shoulder to head, universally, people will say, you're in trouble. But it wasn't always like that. In the 90s, certainly in the 80s and in the 90s, you could bump someone shoulder to head, great bump. You were lauded, absolutely lauded. And it's taken 20 years for the evolution of the bump, for universal acceptance, not only from the players, from obviously players and coaches, and I think they got the message a lot sooner than the media and also the football public, that you can't, we can't accept that. And I think we're going through a similar thing with tackling. And it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but 10 years ago when Bryce Gibbs tackled Robbie Gray, there was outrage. This is the perfect tackle, people said. Chad Wingard at the time, who was a teammate of Robbie Gray's, said, don't understand. I'm confused. This is the perfect tackle. Well, last year we suspended 30 players, and I really, hand on heart, defy anyone that watches a lot of football to say to me that the player behaviour around tackling hasn't changed. It has changed for the better, and it's a cultural shift. And here we are in 2024. We have had so far this year 18,500 508 tackles have been laid in this season. 7 suspensions. So you do the math. So when I hear players say they're confused, I must say I am a little surprised because so many players are getting this right. 18,501 times players have exercised the duty of care in tackling. So I think it's an evolution. I think it's about educating, and I think it's about accepting the fact that we must prioritise players' health and safety. And when we have a scenario, and I'm talking not only about the AFL here, I'm talking about community football, I'm talking about junior football, to be able to set a guideline, to be able to set a standard whereby you know what you can and can't do, and it's an education process, and it's not a process that can be achieved overnight. So yeah, there's been outrage this week. I understand. I must admit I do lock myself away and get off the grid at times because otherwise it can do your head in. But I get it. I understand it. But it is a cultural change that we've got to take. And I think for the long-term benefit of the game around player safety and player health, there needs to be some really strong leadership in this area to help change the perception of the way people think about it. Now,
so where does that leadership come from?
Well, it comes from the AFL.
Yep.
It comes from the AFL. And as I said, I mean, it's not hard to do the maths when you're talking about 18,508 tackles this season. And I could show you, Gerard, I could sit down with you for a day and each round I could show you 200 tackles at least. I don't even know the number, where players have exercised the duty of care in terms of tackling their opponent.
So are we at the point of strict liability? If you tackle, arms pinned, take the opponent to ground and his head hits the turf,
no,
that's a dangerous tackle?
No.
Okay.
I don't want to say it's not strict liability. Each tackle is assessed on its merits, and it's assessed within the factors listed in the guidelines. And the main factors that I consider in today's game, because we've got rid of the spear tackle, we've got rid of the double motion. We don't see it anymore because and we used to see it, but that's player behaviour. That's changed, and players accept that, and they don't. I mean, I hope I'm not, speaking too soon, not going the early crow here on those two factors. So it's around vulnerability and force, and it's interesting because look, his name escapes me. Jack Viney's brother,
Max,
does specialised tackling, jiu-jitsu tackling, and someone sent me a video just this morning, and he's done a video where showing what Toby Bedford should have done. Now that doesn't even involve letting go or loosening, because the tribunal last year in its determinations considered that by letting go just before the player hit the ground, or even loosening your grip on a player being tackled, was akin to exercising a duty of care. And there are a couple of cases that I charged that went to the tribunal, and that was a really good learning for me in my role, because I could get a base on terms of what the tribunal thought was a duty of care. And so we've got to that point. But Max Viney released a video and talking about what Toby should have done with his legs and his body weight rather than do what he did. So I know we ask a lot of players, and I get that. But these are the same players that in an absolute split second can deliver a handball under extraordinary pressure, or can halfway through the kicking motion alter the ball drop in their foot so they kick on the outside of the boot because they've just seen someone halfway through their motion in their peripheral vision. These players are just elite. And I know we're asking a lot of them, but they're capable, and they've already shown with what's happened over the last even 24 months how the tackling behaviour has changed for the better, and full credit to the players, because I don't want to repeat the stat again, but the number of tackles that have occurred this year The players have been phenomenal.
So those who are clinging to the idea that Bedford's has been the archetypal perfect tackle and that there is no alternative, you would say that's now outdated thinking.
I think the Bedford tackle was careless.
Chrisso, you are as knowledgeable about the table of offences as anyone. Careless, intentional, the grading. Do you think it's time that it needs to be modified to fit in with a modern game?
In what way?
Well, you talked about the two other classifiable
Yes.
words before, reckless and what was the other one?
Negligent.
Negligent.
Yeah.
So would you extend it? Would you allow parameters that take into account tackling where when this table of offences was introduced, tackling almost wasn't a reportable offence in any given way?
Oh well, no. It's always been there. I mean,
Not to the same levels though. Not to the same
No.
degree.
Well, not to the same focus.
No.
I think that's probably fair. I mean, Adrian Anderson introduced this table, the matrix, in 2005. I think I'm right in saying. Up until then, it's really interesting. It's interesting for me. Maybe I'll be interested for your listeners, but to go through, because pre that it was a tribunal with a tribunal chairman, and it was, and with all due respect to those great tribunal chairmen, there was a lot of interpretational stuff. They would look at an incident and say 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 week. What Adrian Anderson did in his time at the AFL was introduce a matrix and one of the key reasons was to be transparent to people. Now, since that really rigid matrix, things have been loosened. So I reckon we're probably halfway between the old system, which was a bit dartboardish, with all due respect to the previous tribunal chairman, to Adrian's initial matrix, which was so rigid, to a point where now I've got the capability where an action is so bad that is highly careless, I've got the capability to ramp up the impact under potential to cause a more serious injury. So if I determine that action could have caused a more serious injury, then I've got the capacity to lift the number of weeks of suspension. So what you're talking about, Tom, is almost coming the other way. And even though there's a concussion, to try and lighten the sentence to 3 weeks. Is that what you're...
Well, you spoke about low-end careless before.
Yes.
Low-end careless.
Yes.
So Toby Bedford gets 3 weeks, even
Yes.
though you consider it low-end careless.
That's
and there's
right.
no parameters for you to
But
downgrade
a high-end
it.
careless might attract 7 or 8 weeks.
That's right. So you can go one way but not the other.
Yeah.
So my personal view is the matrix is too rigid for you, and there needs to be other parameters that are involved to allow you more flexibility.
Yeah, look, I don't... I think we've been down that track, and it created, sometimes you've got to be careful what you wish for, it created a whole range of other issues that was found really difficult to try and counteract. What I will say is that Laura Kane and her team have been, one of the great things about what Laura's doing is she's very open to ideas. She's very open, and this whole system, as it is every year, will be reviewed at the end of the year. And look, that's not for me to decide. I will have input into that, and that's one of the great things that Laura's always encouraged for me is to, if you've got ideas, come forward. And so, yeah, of course, and it's reviewed every year. It'll be reviewed again at the end of this year.
But when you take a step back,
Yeah.
do you ever look at it and think, my hands are tied behind my back here? You've got a situation like Toby Bedford, which is a careless tackle and a dangerous tackle according to the parameters that you've worked on before.
Yeah.
But you don't have any choice but to give it 3 weeks. It is either 3 weeks or 0 weeks.
Yeah, I don't feel hamstrung. I suppose I've got the guidelines in front of me. That's what I'm operating on, and so that's what I adjudicate on. So, it's really interesting because people say, it's all about the outcome. Well, it's not always about the outcome, because first and foremost, the decision is about whether an incident is reportable at all, or whether it's careless or intentional. If careless and intentional is not a factor and people are concussed, then there's no case to answer. And when we had the example a couple of weeks ago with Jake Kolodjasny and Mitchell Lewis, and that was so unfortunate for Mitch, not only getting knocked out but doing his knee, but Jake Kolodjasny was contesting the ball in a reasonable way. So we're never going to rid the game of concussion. We're never going. It's impossible because it's such a high impact, high contact sport. But what we can do is to try and minimise those concussions where there has been tackles that have been careless or not reasonable in the circumstances. So,
But is there a way where you can have a system where it's not 3 or 0, where it can be 1 week, even if you can cuss a player in the Bedford instance?
well, as I said, Tom, I mean, I think it's all open slather and to be talked about and reviewed. I mean, I think if someone came up with an idea, well, it would certainly be entertained. But the way the system works at the moment, a low-end careless act that causes a concussion is 3 weeks. A high-end careless action that causes a concussion is probably going to attract, in Jimmy Webster's case, 7 weeks. So that's the delineation. As I say, it will be reviewed, and I know Laura's really keen, not only just the tribunal system or the MRO system, but a whole range of facets, around football that will continually be reviewed.
Is it incongruent that we have moments where, so a flying elbow can be 1 week, a punch to the stomach can be a fine, and a tackle that goes a little awry is 3 weeks? Do you understand that angst?
I do. I do. I really do. It's very challenging. And Gerard, I think as I said, things are in constant review, but it's extraordinarily difficult to come up with a system that's going to cater for everything. But look, I understand people's angst, and I understand people's angst about Toby and Charlie. I really do, because I particularly the Bedford one, I thought long and hard about it. And in the end, hand on heart, I think because Taranto was so highly vulnerable, I thought there was excessive force for that situation, and therefore it tipped over into the careless category. But it is challenging, and impact once the conduct is determined, i.e., either intentional or careless, there is a level of obviously it comes down to a level of impact, and I've got the capacity to increase the level of impact based on that potential to cause clause. But yeah, look, I understand that the system, and it's a bit like umpiring. We strive for perfection, and we do the best we absolutely can with what we've got. I don't think we're ever going to get the perfect game.
Why are all concussions in the severe impact category, which is a move that was made about 2.5 years ago?
Yeah, because it's considered, and I think with additional research and information that's flowed down through from the AFL down through to my function, anyone that argues that a concussion isn't severe, I think is probably on an island by themselves. To say a concussion with what we know now about head trauma is not severe, I think you'd be by yourself.
Are all your judgments now subject to legal oversight?
My judgments are ratified by Laura Kane and Stephen Mead, head of legal, and obviously Laura's head of football. So basically, I determine a grading for all incidents, and there's a lot of incidents. On average, each week there's something like 180 incidents that are cut. There's probably 60 that I look at that are considered close, if not chargeable or offence, and then I make determinations on all those incidents, and that's referred to Laura and Stephen Mead, and they ratify those decisions.
Is there some decent argy-bargy from time to time?
No, not really.
Okay.
It's very smooth sailing. There was a lot of discussion about Braden Maynard last year, but we came to a mutual agreement that it should be charged and went to the tribunal as a consequence. But generally, Stephen and Laura are extraordinarily supportive of what I do. But it's a good system because that they bring a different mindset. I mean, they're dealing with a whole range of other issues that sometimes need to be taken account of. So, but I think the system works well.
You speak about yourself, Chrisso, as one cog in a very large wheel. There's a tribunal system, there's an appeals board, There's clubs that need to make calls. Laura and Stephen Mead as well involved. But you've got a great lens on the entire system. So do you think, and I know you review every year, but do you think this year it needs to be reviewed more sternly because of the public confusion and the frustration and the outcry from not just punters, but also former players and commentators who are confused with what they're seeing in the game?
Yeah, I think this has certainly raised people's eyebrows. I must admit, I'm a little surprised at the outcry this week. As I said, with so many players doing the right thing, and some players that I heard speak during the week who have themselves laid hundreds of tackles this year and not even seen a list that I have looked at in terms of being mildly dangerous to have indicated that they're confused, which is a little confusing for me, to be honest. But look, I think this has certainly raised people's attentions within the AFL and certainly raised my attention, and I think there will be certainly some specific reviewing of how this sort of comes together and how it works.
From a media perspective, in the past you've spoken to the press or to journalists I think it was on a Monday.
Yep.
You are less accessible now than you have been. It's good that you've come in today.
Well, can I say I'm very accessible?
Okay, so would you like to speak to journalists and therefore the public on a weekly basis to explain decisions?
Well, I tell you, so back 5 or 6 years ago, all the determinations were made on a Monday. So I would speak to the media on a Monday afternoon after the determinations and advise of all the sanctions and answer any questions that people had. So what happened subsequent to that is the clubs on a Thursday night were getting frustrated that they didn't find out whether there was a suspension or not until Monday. And I certainly understand that, and so did the AFL. So the system was changed whereby a determination would be made by 5 o'clock the next day. So it almost speaking on a Monday was almost like, it was all done and dusted. In fact, it was a bit embarrassing, Tom, for a few weeks there because no one turned up. And then we had the COVID years where I did a few of those online, but again, the support for it wasn't great. But I'm very accessible. I mean, if you ring me on Gerard rings me and said, "I'd like you to come on the show next week," I'd be happy to. I'm very accessible.
So let's finish with the overarching theme of the week from the ex-players. So a lot of players from your generation.
Yes.
Is the fabric of the game that you played and that you love, at risk with the tighter and tighter parameters that govern instances that cause concussion?
No, it's not. It's not. And at the risk of repeating myself, we've had 18,508 tackles this year, 7 suspensions. So occasionally it's wrong. And I think what players as a general rule have done, the players have been exceptional in exercising a duty of care to their opposition in the cut and thrust of a tackle. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying we're not demanding a lot of the players, but for the betterment of the game, for the longevity of the game, for the ability of players to feel like, and parents to push their kids into football, to feel like that player safety is absolute premium here. I make no excuses for that. I think that's where we've got to be. And yeah, there's the odd one. The last outcry, I reckon, was 10 years ago. But there's the odd one that people don't think is careless. I personally think, given the high vulnerability of both players in this situation and the force exerted in both situations, that it did get into the careless category. And as such, I sanctioned them, which was supported by the tribunal. But at the base of everything, no, the fabric of the game is not under threat. And so many players are doing the right thing. And I think the final thing I would say is that, and to reiterate, I think player safety is just, it's so critical to the longevity of the game and to the longevity of players and for the health and safety of players when they finish playing in their later life, that we need to be strong. We need to be strong with these type of incidents to ensure that players and media and the football public understand that they're just not acceptable in the game.
Michael Christian, thanks for your time.